if it wasn't obvious before, it is obvious after this past weekend. College football is crazy. And as we are approaching the end of the college football regular season, and we are approaching the bowl selections and the playoff selections, already I'm sure 90% of the country's brackets are busted now after Iowa's drubbing of Ohio State and Penn State's consecutive losses and all sorts of other things. But there is one college football playoff scenario that nobody is talking about as a possibility, but it could very well happen, and I'm going to tell you how. Number one, first off, there is no scenario I can think of in which two teams from the same conference are going into the playoff both. With the possible exception of Georgia beating Alabama in the SEC title game, Alabama may only drop to 4. Although, I would argue that it's not fair to other teams to put in two teams from the same conference if they met in the conference championship game. My reasoning for that is it's already on a neutral field. Why would you have a second game, rematch game of the conference championship on another neutral field? That defeats the purpose of a conference championship. A couple weeks ago, I could have seen a situation where Ohio State and Penn State both got in, but I don't see that happening now. So Alabama is going to win out. There is no doubt in my mind. I've watched several Alabama games this year. They look like the best team in the country. They have not played a great schedule so far. If you don't count Florida State because of the disaster season that they've had, then last weekend with LSU was the first time they played a ranked team all year. I don't count Florida State because the fact that they've completely imploded post DeAndre Francois proves that their problems were more than a quarterback. So Alabama is going to win out. If they beat Georgia in the SEC championship, in which they would probably go into that game 1-2, assuming that both win out, then Georgia would go home. Georgia would probably go to the Peach Bowl, and Alabama would be in the national semifinals. Because as I said, you don't want to defeat the purpose of the SEC championship game. As a good friend of mine, Colin Cowherd, said, that is your playoff game, and I agree with that. The SEC championship is Georgia's playoff game in this situation. So Alabama is in. Clemson is in. Clemson has not lost a game in which Kelly Bryant was not nursing injury and they were nursing other problems. The Syracuse loss is damning to some teams, but for Clemson being the defending national champions, they should be fine. They've played great. Kelly Bryant has been great. They've blown teams out. He seems to have recovered fairly well. There's no reason that they shouldn't be in the playoff if they win out. The ACC is where things get really interesting because Miami is also undefeated. They will probably go into the championship game against Clemson, but Clemson would steamroll Miami. Miami has been getting close wins all year. They won by a single point over Georgia Tech. They only beat Florida State by 4. They needed some magic to beat North Carolina a couple weeks ago. I'm not sold on Notre Dame. They also have one less game because of the cancellation from the hurricane, so that is a blemish on their record since they have one less data point than everybody else. Now, the last two spots is where it gets interesting. If Notre Dame wins out, which I think they will, I think Miami's luck is going to run out next week when they face Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame will win that game, and that will eliminate any chance Miami has of getting in. I also think that Notre Dame will beat Stanford, and they should obviously beat Navy. Those are their only games remaining, is Miami, Navy, and Stanford. They should win out. even though they don't play in a conference, they were the real winner off of this weekend of Penn State going down again and Ohio State going down in dramatic fashion. They were the real beneficiaries because now, even without that extra data point of a conference championship game, Notre Dame will have only had one loss all year, and it will have been a 1-point loss to Georgia, who was the SEC runner-up and the number 2 team for a big portion of the second half of the year. So Notre Dame in this situation plays Clemson in one of the 2 semifinal matchups. We're going to say maybe the Rose Bowl. That seems like a good place for Notre Dame to be on the national stage. And for the Sugar Bowl matchup, here's where things get interesting because Oklahoma is probably going to win the Big 12. I think they would beat TCU in a 1-2 Big 12 championship game matchup. But I also think that we're going to see quite a bit of chaos in this last week. I have, in this scenario, Michigan State getting the number 4 spot. I think they will win next week against Ohio State. Ohio State coming off the dreadful loss to Iowa, 55-24. Michigan State, I have them winning out after that game. They beat Michigan on the road, so they should be able to beat Ohio State on the road. In that situation, they would finish with Maryland and Rutgers, 2 cupcake games that would help them build their resume. If they beat Wisconsin in Indianapolis in the Big Ten Championship on a neutral site, even with Oklahoma's impressive Big 12 conference champion resume, I don't think there's any way you could argue that Michigan State would not be the superior team, having beaten Ohio State on the road just like Oklahoma did, having also beaten Michigan on the road, having beaten Penn State, and having beaten the previously undefeated Wisconsin, who I believe will win out. But if Michigan State beats them in the Big Ten championship game, then they would get in. So in this situation, I haven't heard anybody talking about it, but I think this could very well go down. Alabama and Michigan State would be playing in a national semifinal, a rematch of the game from 2 years ago. Clemson and Notre Dame would be playing in the other semifinal, either the Rose or the Sugar Bowl. Wow. So we could have an Alabama-Clemson rubber match in the national championship. We could have Alabama and Notre Dame, a rematch from a few years ago. We could have Notre Dame and Michigan State, a rematch from earlier this year. We could have Clemson and Michigan State. Let me know in the comments what you think the national championship game would be under this scenario. This has been The Hard Truth. See you next time.